Hi, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here again with the second half of my video lecture on Chapter 6, Intro to Macroeconomics and GDP. We just went over basically the central definition of GDP, and which was that GDP, gross domestic product, is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a specific country during a specific period of time. So now I want to address each piece of that definition. Why market value? Why only include goods and services? Why only final goods and services? Why are we measuring this within a single country? Why are we only looking at a single period of time? So we're going to address each of these questions one by one. So GDP is looking at market value. This is the quantity of something produced times the per unit price that it sells for. Quantities alone are not going to provide us with enough information. The units for various quantities, first of all, can't be added together, right? We can't add together gallons of milk, cups of coffee, pounds of steak, bottles of perfume, like they all have different units. So that makes it hard. So first, converting them all into dollars makes the units consistent so that we can add them or aggregate them. And finally, it also tells us kind of like the relative importance of the production of a certain good or service in the bigger picture. So because sometimes the quantity of something is very, very large that we produce, but the value of that quantity is actually low relative to other things. I'm thinking here in this example about corn versus automobiles, right? So let's look at this example in greater depth. Let's assume that in the United States, in a given year, we produce 12 billion bushels of corn, but only 8 million automobiles. Well, if we were to look at output alone, that would lead us to believe that corn is a really, really important output factor to our overall GDP, just because the quantity is so much larger. However, when we take into account the market value of that production, we see that corn only sells for $5 a bushel, whereas a vehicle or an automobile sells for, let's say on average, $30,000 each. So when we convert quantities into market values by multiplying times the per unit price that it sells for, we can see that the overall contribution to GDP for automobiles is actually much higher, despite it being a lower quantity, right? So that out of the $300 billion of market value from these two goods, 240 billion of it comes just from the automobile sales. So these numbers, the market value numbers, tell a different story than the quantities could alone. When we account for market value, we can look at the relative portion of GDP in terms of overall value to economic income, national income, and output than we could if we looked at just quantity numbers. We have to be really careful here. Remember from the first half of this lecture that we have to remember that in general, prices tend to rise over time due to inflation. So even if production levels stay the same, if prices are going up, GDP will look higher. So that's why it's really important to adjust for inflation, so we really know what's happening with output when we're looking at GDP. All right, so GDP is looking at specifically the market value of goods and services. Goods are tangible things like food, clothing, cars, houses. Services are less tangible, sometimes intangible. It's when you are doing something for someone else, right? So this is like providing healthcare, entertainment, counseling, consultation, advice, travel, banking, right? These are all services that we need that have a value associated with the economic activity of providing them. So actually a higher percentage of our GDP now comes from services than it ever has before. Services account for almost 2/3 of our total output. The graph on this slide shows that over the last 68 years, services are making up an increasing share of US GDP. So this is measuring the percent of total GDP made up by services alone. And this has been really what you might hear of as a shift from a goods economy into a services economy. In the past, the dominant industries in the United States were the production of goods like automobiles, steel, and other household goods. Over time, this has shifted, and now the majority of US GDP is service output, mostly financial services, transportation services, retail, and technology services. So we've seen approximately a growth of 42% in the amount of GDP accounting for services between 1950 and 2018. So let's talk about what we mean when we say that GDP is only including final goods and services. So final goods and services are the goods and services that are sold to the final actual user of that product or service. This is what's included in GDP. However, we know that that final product had to go through a lot of transformation in order to become that final product. And along the way, there are intermediate goods that are sold between suppliers, producers, packagers that go into making that final product. If we were to count the market value of the intermediate goods, then also count the sale of the final product, we would be double counting, right? And so what we do is we look at the goods that the firms use to repackage and bundle with other goods that then become sold as a more finalized product, and we don't include those intermediate sales in the GDP. So for example, we don't include milk that is bought by a coffee shop and then used in selling their coffee products. We only count the coffee products that are actually sold to the consumer who's going to use it. We don't count the tires that are sold to an automobile manufacturer because those tires add value to the automobile, and we count the sale of the automobile to the final end user. So we're really counting things that are either sold directly to the consumer or are at the point of use. So for example, the column on the right here, well, let's look at this. These are the steps to selling or like creating a laptop. So the first step is that we actually have to take all the inside technological pieces and put it into an outer case and add a keyboard. Then we have to deal with making all the internal hardware installed and including an operating system to make the things work. You can tell that this is why I specialize in teaching economics and not making computers. Then you have to be able to connect it to a network, and then you get the retail sale of it, right? On the very right-hand side, the column on the right is the running total of all the value added at each step. And so if we were to look at the prices that each step, that was the piece each step was sold at on the right, it would add up to a total value of $338 from putting together this laptop. But that's really double counting, because at each step, you're recounting the value of the thing that already happened. So to get a more accurate measure of GDP, we really only want to look at the sales price of the final good, not the value of each added step along the way. Some people will measure GDP as the accumulation of the steps, but then not count the final sale. The thing is you have to do one or the other, but not both. The most accurate measure of GDP is going to be the measure of the market value from selling the final product, in this case, $199. So like, why don't we count expenditures on intermediate goods? That's because if we did, they're going to be double counted and really give us an inaccurate view of the total amount of output coming out of an economy. Right? So like, to give you another example, maybe the computer example was confusing to you because I don't make computers and it was confusing to me. Think about pizza. I have made a pizza before for myself, not to sell, but imagine, right? We're not going to count the cheese, the sauce, the dough, and then also the pizza, because that would be double counting. You could count either the individual pieces, cheese, sauce, dough, or you could count just the value of what I could sell my end pizza for, but definitely not both. That would be double counting. Okay, so we look at final goods and market value of final goods and services within a particular country. So when we look at within a particular country, this can sometimes be confusing now that our economy has become so incredibly globalized, because, for example, the US could be the producer of something, but the place where we produce it is in, say, Thailand, right? And so it's hard then to say, where does that GDP go? Because GDP would say that should be counted as GDP in Thailand, because that's where the output is produced. But we have a different measure to measure the production for like where the firm that produces the thing originates. And this is called gross national product, GNP. This is measuring the total market value of all goods and services produced by workers and resources owned by the residents of a particular nation, no matter where it happens. Okay, so more and more often now, people are using GNP to measure a nation's overall production, noticing that like the production itself is no longer so place-based as it used to be. So for example, if Nike shoes are made in Thailand, since Nike is a US company, those shoes are going to count towards the US's GNP because Nike is a US company, but it would count towards Thailand's GDP because that's the location, the place where the output was produced. Okay, so not only do we limit it to a particular country, so GDP, physically where is it produced, GNP, who owns the resources that produced it. But it's also only during a particular period of time. This avoids issues of double counting because sometimes we produce things in one period, but we don't sell them in that same period, right? For example, a new car that's produced and sold in 2018 and then resold 2 years later by that first owner, right? So usually we're looking at GDP figures in a particular year, but we could also look at GDP in a month or in a quarter or over a multi-year period. GDP is only going to measure the production from a specific period, regardless of the length of that period. You just have to name what it is. This is to avoid issues of double counting. So we don't want to recount a good that was produced and then sold later. So we count only the sale of the initial product, not the resale of it, because nothing new has been produced. We're going to go more into this because there are some different categories of items that make for an interesting case here. But in general, we want to be thinking about the market value at the point of production when it was produced. All right. So all of that to say, that's the definition. We are looking at total market value of all goods and services, final goods and services produced within a certain country during a certain period of time. Okay. Whew. Now we can look at how GDP is broken up. Like, how do we measure those goods and services? Okay, the Bureau of Economic Analysis is the government agency that is in charge of this in the United States. They tally all the GDP data, and that task is called national income accounting. In general, this is the equation we use for measuring GDP. Y is output, that's GDP. So GDP is equivalent to the sum of 4 components. Those components are C for consumption, I for investment, G for government purchases, and NX to represent net exports. Net exports is simply the difference between the amount of exports minus the amount of imports. We're going to look at each component individually in the upcoming slides. Let's first start with consumption. Consumption is measuring the purchase of final goods and services by households, but it excludes new housing because new housing is going to be a form of investment. So consumption is divided into 3 categories: durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Again, purchased at the final point of sale by households. Durable goods are things that are consumed over a long period of time and therefore have significant fluctuation in when we buy these things and how much they cost. This is like automobiles or refrigerators, right? You buy a car hoping it's going to last you 10 years. You buy a refrigerator hoping it could last you 20 years, right? This is a durable good. When economic times are bad, so we have like high job loss or high levels of uncertainty, lower incomes, you usually see people putting off purchases of durable goods and using the old one for a longer period of time. Non-durable goods are consumed over a short period of time. They're usually things that you buy to consume immediately and don't plan to last very long. These are things that we purchase regardless of overall economic conditions, like food and clothing. Okay, the second component, the I, is investment. Investment is private spending on tools, factories, plants here meaning like a factory, something that like the place where you produce something, and equipment. So we're spending on those things with the goal of producing future output. That's investment. So these include capital purchases. Capital purchases is private spending on future output. This might also include a change in business inventory. So inventory are the goods that have been produced but not yet sold. So they represent future increases in output. So if you were to increase your inventory today, it would allow a firm to produce more as an investment for the future. So for example, let's say like a large printing company is really confident in the demand for books and magazines. And that's going to be really robust in the months ahead. So it might increase its supply of paper now, so it will not have a shortage later when demand increases. So like, since paper takes a long time to deliver from factory to factory, if the company didn't have the paper on hand, it could lose business because it's not able to print the books and magazines that the publisher is looking for. So increasing supply of paper today is an investment in the output of books and magazines in the future. In this same way, the reason we don't count new residential housing as consumption is because it's really an investment in the future. New home purchases are something that we're looking at investing in the production of later things. They don't really represent new production in that period of time, but because people tend to live in their residential housing for long periods of time and will experience on the individual and household level economic growth in their production capacity that tends to grow after investing in a home purchase. So that's why we consider it investment and not consumption. All right, here's an example. So let's say in 2017, Ford automobile company produces 500 trucks. Each of them is worth $40,000. But in 2017, they don't sell all 500 of them. They only sell 400 and they keep the other 100 in inventory to sell in 2018. So what happens to GDP? Well, what we're going to see is that in terms of GDP, it's going to measure $16 million in consumption, which is the 400 automobiles or so 400 trucks sold at $40,000 a piece. That'll be measured as consumption in time period 2017. The trucks that are produced in 2017 but not sold but kept in inventory, so that is 100 trucks at $40,000 a piece. The value of that is $4 million, and that's going to count in 2017 GDP, not 2018, but it counts under the category of investment. Okay, so the net result is that the total amount, all 500 trucks at $40,000 a piece, so in other words, $20 million, is counted in 2017 GDP. It's just going to be split between consumption category and investment category, depending on how much is sold and how much is kept in inventory. So we can see here, right, in 2018, that investment turns into consumption. And so that's why we don't want to double count it as consumption in 2017. Okay. Government purchases, the next category of GDP. Government purchases is all spending by the government on final goods and services. So like this is whenever government, either state, local, or federal government, is putting money into the goods and services provided to the residents of their economy. So this is like employee salaries, public works projects, schools, national defense, post offices, right? What we don't count here are transfer payments. Transfer payments that the government makes to households such as Medicare, welfare, Social Security, are not going to be included as part of government purchases because it's essentially income that's transferred from the government to individuals, and those individuals are going to spend that income, and so it will be categorized in either consumption or investment, depending on how those individual households use that money. But we don't want to double count it, so it's just a transfer of income from the government to individuals for spending. So that's why transfer payments are not included in government purchases. And finally, NX, net exports. The net here just means this is exports minus imports. Exports are goods that are produced inside of our country, but then sold elsewhere. Imports are goods that are produced elsewhere, but then bought inside of our own country. Okay, and so exports are things going out, imports are things coming in. Net exports is the difference between what goes out and what comes in, right? When we are importing, bringing in more than we are exporting, we call that a trade deficit, meaning that we're consuming more of other people's things than our own. If we are exporting more than we're importing, we call that a trade surplus, meaning we're producing more than what we are consuming from other people. A trade deficit is not a bad thing. Even though we associate that word deficit with like some negative connotation, it's not always a bad thing. More imports means that there are more goods and services for people to buy in this country. There's a number of articles that discuss kind of the value of a trade deficit. It's not necessarily bad. Even though a trade deficit, therefore, based on net exports, is going to decrease our GDP, right? Because it's net exports. So if we have more imports coming in than exports, then that counts against our GDP. So it makes GDP smaller, but it implies that we're actually able to consume more. So this can be confusing. We'll look at more examples in class of this, but just here, don't necessarily connect the term trade deficit with being something bad. All right, let's look at US GDP. This is for the year 2018. This is the total composition of where our GDP comes from. Again, this data is all conglomerated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is a government agency, and their job is to calculate all these GDP statistics. So in 2018, US GDP was equal to about $20.5 trillion. The largest component of our GDP is by far consumption, followed by investment and government purchases. Here, since net exports are negative, that means that we have a trade deficit. That's what it's saying. It's saying imports are greater than exports. So to get a sense for what this means, we would have to either like compare these numbers to other nations, or we really are looking at how each of these components might be allocated or split among individuals in society. That's also another really interesting way to use this data. So the biggest component of GDP is going to be consumption. It's much, much bigger than other components. It accounts for almost 10 trillion out of a $15 trillion GDP. Net exports actually tend to be negative because in the US, we often find ourselves in a trade deficit, just meaning that we import more than we export. Okay, now let's use this information to think about looking at economic growth. So a couple things to get out of the way. This little triangle right here, this is a Greek letter delta. It literally, every time you see that little triangle, you can think the word change. It represents a change in. So when we're looking at a change, we're going to use a percentage formula. So a percentage change is going to be the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. And then we multiply by 100 to turn it into a percentage. Okay, so let's look at an example here. If we wanted to look at the change in nominal GDP growth, or we want to look at the growth in nominal GDP, the change in nominal GDP, we would look at the new GDP, 2018, subtract old GDP, 2017, and divide by old GDP, 2017, then multiply by 100 to change it into a percentage. So here's an example. If we want to use price level, the GDP deflator in our growth rate, then we can actually use the percent change in the price level the same way. So here's an example from that original table where we're looking at price levels in the first half of this lecture. So if we wanted to look at how price levels have changed over time, then we look at the new price level, subtract the old price level, divided by the old price level, right? So let me pull up that table real quick. I think it's this one. Nope, it isn't, or even earlier one. Hold on a second. Here we go, these are price levels, right? So if we're looking at how much prices changed between 2017 and 2018, we can calculate the percent change in this price level. So the price level in 2017 was 108. The price level in 2018 was 110. Okay, so now let's return to the slide we want to be on. Which is here. Okay, so we want to look at the percent change in price level. How much do prices go up? So the 2018 price level is 110. We subtract the 2017 price level, 108. Then we divide that amount by the old price level, 2017, 108. Then multiply by 100 to get a percentage. This gives us a percent change in price level of 1.9%. This is the inflation rate. This is the rate at which prices are going up. So between 2017 and 2018, prices rose by 1.9%. This is inflation. Another useful formula for you to know here is that we can look at the percent change in nominal GDP as the percent change in real GDP plus the percent change in the price level. So let's do an example of that. Let's look at nominal GDP growth. So what we're looking at is GDP in 2018. We subtract GDP in 2017 and divide by GDP in 2017. So new minus old divided by old, multiplied by 100. So we plug in these numbers and we can see that nominal GDP grew by 4.1% between 2017 and 2018. So that's like overall output went up, or the value of the output between 2017 and 2018 went up by 4.1%, but this is nominal. So it hasn't accounted for inflation, right? It hasn't accounted for the fact that prices also went up in this period. Okay. So we've talked about how we use GDP, how it's broken down, how we calculate it. Now let's talk about some of the shortcomings of using this measure in general. Using GDP as a measure of welfare is not perfect. There are a lot of shortcomings that either might underestimate the value of our output or cause a bias in what counts and what doesn't count. All right, so there are a couple things that are just not taken into account or not part of the GDP model. They don't fall anywhere into those 4 categories. They include non-market goods, transactions that happen in the underground economy, the quality of the environment as a result of us using it as a source for our inputs and a sink for our pollution, and the value of leisure time, the time we spend not producing anything. Let's go into each of these. Non-market goods are goods and services that are produced but not bought and sold in a marketplace. These often are uncompensated household activities, right? So it's a service often that you're producing, but no one is buying and selling it. So the value of it isn't counted, even though you are really expending your own time and energy as a resource. Non-market goods still create value for society. They include any kind of household production that's not directly compensated for, like washing dishes, mowing lawns, cleaning, childcare, right? If you are providing the childcare for your own children, it's not counted in GDP. But if you send your children to daycare and someone else is providing childcare for your children and you pay them to do so, it is counted in GDP, right? But both are still providing the same service. One is counted, one is not. So when the non-market segment of the economy is especially large, it can really lead to some dramatic undercounting of the annual output that's being produced. This is most prevalent in less developed countries where they have less access to markets. So like in less developed societies, the household produces a lot of their own goods. Like they make and produce many of the things that they consume. They don't rely on interdependence and trade in markets. And so GDP might not be a really effective or accurate measure of their overall output because so much of that output is created but not traded. Okay. Underground economy. So if transactions are not directly measurable because it's not reported, then they're not included in official GDP. So any transactions that are not reported to the government and therefore not taxed, not part of GDP. This does include illegal transactions, but also legal transactions, such as tipping your, waiter or waitress if you're using cash and it's not reported. If tips are not reported, then it's part of an underground economy, even though it's not a legal activity, right? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has estimated that in developed countries, the underground economy is actually about the size of 15% of total GDP. Whereas in transitioning economies that are kind of in the industrialization process, the amount of underground activity can account for 20 to 30% of GDP. And in countries that are still developing, They have an underground economy that operates in cash where transactions are not reported. That can be as much as 45% of their GDP. These are often underground economies are also called shadow economies. The US is believed to have one of the smallest shadow economies in the world, meaning that we report most of our transactions, most of the production and sale of the things that are produced in our country. Because most citizens in our country can actually accumulate more wealth by legitimately participating in a market economy rather than engaging in illegal activities. A very strong economy is going to be one that creates jobs and opportunities for investment and therefore reduces the size of the shadow economy. Corruption is a lot less common in the United States than in other countries. So we're relatively free to enter into market transactions with one another without bribes or without having to deal with organized crime. But this is often not the case in many developing countries. So this is something to think about in terms of whether GDP is a really accurate measure of the activity that's happening in the economy of a given country. Quality of the environment. So every time we produce something, there is an environmental cost associated with it, because in order to produce anything, we are at some point extracting resources from the environment. So we use it as a source for our inputs of production. And by extracting resources from the environment, we are degrading the quality of environmental systems. And not only that, through our production, we create waste products, which often end up back in the environment in the form of pollution. So production of goods and services is hitting the environment in two places, both as a source of inputs and as a sink for waste. But this decrease in the value of the environment or the degradation of environmental resources over time is not accounted for in GDP. So GDP can rise and rise and rise. You're growing your economy. And if your environment, if it's at a detriment to your environment, is that growth in GDP actually a benefit, right? That's the question here. How do we balance those things? Generally, we assume that people assign positive values to the environment, right? We love having beautiful scenery, clean air, clean water, but none of those things are valued in GDP. So GDP might not always be the most accurate measure of overall well-being if we're including environmental well-being. Leisure time. So again, GDP is only measuring what we produce, but there's value in the time that we spend and the energy we spend not producing things, right? There's a lot of value to leisure. And so GDP is only measuring labor. In general, we have a pretty extensive work week in the United States. We work on average, the average person works 36 hours per week. That this varies country to country. And there's always kind of, we have this association with higher levels of GDP are correlated with better environment, higher quality of life, better access to healthcare, better access to education, more leisure time, low crime rates. And that's because when you have higher GDP per capita, individuals can afford to invest in those areas of their life and are less worried about mere survival, right? Basic necessities. Alternative measures of, how valuable leisure is are hard to quantify. And so we tend to think that although leisure time is not directly included in the measure of GDP, higher GDP per capita is usually associated with greater leisure time overall, right? It's like the more wealth I accumulate, the more of an ability I have to take breaks, take vacations, take time off. Okay, which of the following is not included in GDP? Here, Michael pays the neighbor kid to mow his yard and pays him in cash. This is shadow economy transaction, not recorded by the government and therefore not in GDP. All right, despite its shortcomings, GDP is still a really effective tool for measuring general living standard and therefore satisfaction with the quality of your life. Two economists, Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, find evidence that wealthier individuals tend to report greater life satisfaction than poorer people in the same country. And wealthier nations tend to report greater life satisfaction than poorer nations. Obviously, money does not equal happiness, but having more money makes it so that you can focus less on survival and like necessities for survival and focus more on the things that you enjoy. Here's a correlation graph where it shows on the x-axis GDP per capita, and then on the y-axis reported satisfaction on a scale from 0 to 10. And you can see that in general, nations that have higher GDP per capita also report higher satisfaction. So it's not perfect, but in this chapter, in these two lectures, we did learn about the foundational measure of economic output, which is gross domestic product, GDP. This is by definition, the market value of all final goods and services produced within a given country within a specific period of time. We use GDP to examine factors like economic growth and fluctuations in economic activity, both expansions and contractions, as well as long-run trends. And then we can also use it to make cross-country or cross-national comparisons to look at general satisfaction and well-being across a society. Okay, that was chapter 6. This is going to form a foundation for information going forward. We're going to build off of this idea of GDP and include it in pretty much every chapter going forward. So make sure that you feel really solid on these concepts. And if you have any questions, bring them with you to class. And I look forward to hearing them and helping you feel really grounded with this material. I'll see you next time.